G'day everyone, and thanks for coming to our last cybersecurity lunch and learn session of the year. Appreciate your attendance. For those of you who don't know or didn't come to the last lunch and learn session, my name's Aaron. I'm from the AMP cybersecurity team. And today we're going to be looking, I guess, at a little bit of at cybersecurity through a bit of a different lens to what we've traditionally looked at it through when we've been talking about it in the various lunch and learn sessions, and generally in all the awareness messages you see around AMP when it comes to cybersecurity. What I mean by that is, well, we're going to look at cyber warfare. And really, at the most fundamental or at a high level, the attacks you see when we're talking about cyber warfare, as we're going to see in a moment, traditionally or conventionally aren't really entirely different from the sorts of attacks we even see at organisations like AMP. The difference is fundamentally in the motivations of the attackers who are launching these attacks. So whereas with traditional types of cyber attacks, when we talk about cyber attacks at AMP, we talk about it in the context of cyber criminals really doing this to either cause reputational harm or damage to either us as individuals or the companies we work for the purposes of generating a profit for their businesses, because really that's what cybercrime is. It's fundamentally a business for cyber attackers. Cyber warfare is a little bit different. The motivations are starkly different. It's largely happening at a nation-state level. So it's where one nation-state or one country is targeting another nation-state for a variety of reasons, but typically it's often to influence the behaviour of that nation-state. What we're going to see in today's presentation is that there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of ambiguity around cyber warfare, what the scope of cyber warfare is, how it's going to unfold in the future. But it's quite a poignant time to discuss it. Some of you may have seen in the news today, the nation of Georgia actually suffered a significant cyber attack very, very recently that's speculated to have its origins from Russia, although it's not confirmed at this stage. And over 2,000 websites, some of them affiliated with the government, and the infrastructure of a major television station was targeted and taken down as a result of that attack. So it's quite a poignant time to talk about cyber warfare, given its relevance and its increasing prominence in the context of the societies in which we live. So firstly, we'll have a bit of an introduction to what cyber warfare is. And what I mean by that is we'll look at what's a possible working definition of cyber warfare. It's not that easy at any more than a high level to define what cyber warfare is, but we'll give that a shot. And then we'll look at some examples of conventional ways, and when I use that term in inverted commas, but conventional ways in which cyber warfare, or some examples of ways in which cyber warfare has unfolded in the past, or in the past 5 to 10 years in particular. We're then going to look at some possible future directions for cyber warfare. And that'll be a really interesting discussion on some of the emerging technology trends and how they could influence the way cyber warfare unfolds in the future. The fear of escalation is really about this concern about the rise of what's called a cyber Cold War, to parallel the geopolitical tensions that arose between the Soviet Union and the United States in the 20th century. And we'll talk about that in the context of cyber warfare when we get to that part of the presentation. And the last bit will be this concept of establishing norms. And what that means is traditional warfare, unfortunately, physical warfare is something the world has a lot of familiarity with. And so the rules that govern traditional warfare are well established. There are well established international law rules around how nations should behave when it comes to traditional warfare. Unfortunately, that's not currently the case with cyber warfare. So we'll look at that in the last part of the presentation. Okay. I don't think this is anything revolutionary, but it's worth just mentioning to set the context. Even compared to 15, 20 years ago, many of the critical pieces of infrastructure our societies rely upon to function. So, whether we're talking things like electricity, gas, water, those types of critical infrastructure industries, nuclear power, transport systems, airports, metro systems, all these sorts of, all these sorts of systems have transitioned from a situation where human decision-making formed a key part of the way those systems operated on a day-to-day basis. And that's increasingly moved to the fringe. And now these types of technologies and these types of pieces of infrastructure more and more rely on on digital technology and computer systems to function at their core. And that obviously introduces tremendous conveniences and efficiencies. But what it does do is it makes more and more of the societies in which we all reside around the globe more ripe for potential cyber warfare attacks. And when we're talking about cyber warfare, at a very high level, we can refer to it as, I guess, the use of a digital attack of some sort by one nation state to influence and target the behaviour of another nation state. We'll look at some examples of that in a moment. And that's the key differentiator of cyber warfare compared to conventional types of cybercrime. It's that nation-state element. So it's typically cyber criminals acting on behalf of a nation-state or intelligence forces acting on behalf of a nation-state to cause damage or harm of some sort or influence the behaviour of another nation-state. What we are starting to see is a transition too. In the last 5 to 10 years, cyber warfare has been this emerging field, and we've seen sort of typically one-off types of attacks against one country suffered by another country. But what we will start to see more and more of is the nature of this will start to change, and we'll start to see more sustained skirmishes where one country attacks another, and then there's a response, whether that's in the cyber world or whether that's in the physical world. And there's an interesting example that occurred earlier this year, which I'll talk about in a moment. One of the reasons that cyber warfare is growing at a rapid rate in terms of its frequency and the, I guess, its prominence in the world of warfare is nation states or countries are very familiar, most nation states are very familiar with the concept of traditional physical warfare and have well-established defences at air, land and sea. But that doesn't always translate to the cyber world. It's only in the last 5 years, really, that many countries are starting to realise the importance of investing money and resources into developing strong cyber defences that parallel their physical warfare-related defences. So there's an opportunity for countries to target that or those weaknesses to more effectively influence the behaviour of another nation state than they might have been able to with physical warfare attacks. The political capital associated nowadays for most countries with putting soldiers' lives at risk by sending them into war is very unpalatable. And so naturally, if you have an opportunity to avoid doing that by focusing more on cyber warfare efforts, that's also going to be an attractive proposition to many countries. The asymmetrical effect really refers to this concept that with cyber warfare, it's very possible for a very small number of people, a small cyber army, to cause tremendous damage to another country. So the economies of scale associated with launching cyber warfare-related attacks can be very advantageous to the attacker. Just some examples, and we could talk all day about cyber warfare examples that have occurred over the last 5 to 10 years. So I've just picked out a handful. Stuxnet is considered one of the earliest examples of a cyber warfare type of attack, and it occurred in 2010, so almost 10 years ago now. And this was really, or it's speculated to have been, a collaboration between Israeli and US intelligence forces, basically targeting the Iranian nuclear program that was speculated to be occurring at the time. Stuxnet was a piece of malware that was circulated via malicious emails and targeted certain nuclear facilities in Iran. And eventually, the security of the operational systems of these nuclear facilities was interfered with thanks to the presence of this malware. And this enabled the centrifuges in the operational systems of these nuclear plants to be interfered with. So the centrifuges essentially spin at a high speed to separate isotopes in uranium gas. The Stuxnet malware was able to interfere with the operation of those centrifuges and basically damage them to render those nuclear facilities relatively useless or inhibit their performance quite significantly. So Stuxnet was a really interesting example that occurred in 2010. Not so long ago, probably about 3.5 years ago now, a really interesting example occurred in the Christmas period of 2015. In the Western Ukraine. 3 power stations were taken offline by a sustained cyber attack. And what this meant was that around 230,000 Ukrainian citizens had no power or had their power cut off for a period of 6 hours over the Christmas period. Now, interestingly, as part of this attack, the cyber attackers also launched a separate, what's called a denial of service attack, against the call centres or the contact centres for these power companies. What that meant was that they couldn't be contacted and they couldn't communicate with their customers during the course of this power outage. So you can imagine the panic that would have caused and the difficulties that would have caused for the power companies in terms of being able to ascertain the scope of the problem and communicate effectively with their customers. So this was also a really interesting example, and much like the Stuxnet example, it was heavily researched and very carefully planned and thought out. It's speculated again that the origins of this attack were from Russia, although it's never again been officially confirmed. But there are good reasons to suspect it was Russia. Now, again, it relied on the circulation of malicious emails over a period of time and using malicious software to compromise the security of the operational systems in these power plants. And going to this year, some of you may have heard about this and may be familiar with this episode, but the United States and Iran were involved in a very significant exchange in June of this year. And there are a couple of different episodes that occurred which ultimately resulted in the US launching or commissioning a cyber attack, targeting key computer systems controlling rocket and missile launches in Iran, and quite successfully launching that attack. What they did, the attack was in retaliation for a couple of episodes. Firstly, it related to 2 US oil tankers that were transiting through the Gulf of Oman, and they were mysteriously attacked by foreign vessels and suffered significant damage. The US speculated or believed that Iran was responsible for that. Iran denied responsibility. Just a week later, a US surveillance drone was flying close to Iranian airspace, and Iran believed that it had incurred into its airspace and shot it down. Now, the United States initially considered launching or taking soldiers into the region or increasing its presence in the region as a result of these attacks. But then it decided on launching a formal cyber attack in response. And I think this is an interesting trend that we're going to see more and more of. This fusion between physical warfare and cyber warfare, where sometimes one nation will launch a physical warfare attack of some sort or vice versa, and the response will be the opposite. It'll either be a cyber attack or a physical warfare attack. So this was a really interesting example that occurred just earlier this year. As I've already indicated, particularly with the attack in Western Ukraine and Stuxnet, a lot of the attack types aren't that different to what we talk about when we're talking about the importance of security and being mindful of cybersecurity at AMP. The difference is the nation-state dimension. It's really targeted at a nation-state. There are some new trends emerging which could, however, influence, the way these cyber warfare unfolds in the future. So I just wanted to talk about a few of those. Electronic warfare is an interesting one, and it goes hand in hand with drone technology, or at least that's how it appears it's going to unfold. Now, drones have been used in physical warfare for some time already. We've seen things like the incident at London Gatwick Airport and the potential for it to shut down, a drone technology to shut down a critical piece of infrastructure for a period of time. The president of Venezuela was subjected to an alleged assassination attempt using drone technology that had weapons attached to it, which apparently fired at the president of Venezuela. There was an attack on a Saudi oil processing plant earlier this year with drone technology. So that's not really what I'm talking about here. I consider that almost more in the realms of physical warfare. But there's also this aspect where drones can carry what are called electronic warfare devices to be able to intercept or sabotage or shut down communication systems in a foreign nation state. And as our societies are now, even compared to 50 years ago, heavily reliant on communication systems for so many different purposes, that can have a devastating effect, particularly if it's coupled with a physical warfare attack of some kind. So in 2018, an Israeli firm called Septier Communications announced the first drone with an electronic warfare device attached that could effectively intercept communications and transmit them to a third party for any 3G and 4G mobile networks. Earlier this year, an Italian tech military contractor called Silix Galileo developed or has filed a patent for an electronic warfare device that can effectively jam or disrupt communication systems for key types of communication networks when it's in close proximity. So, for example, it could shut down a portion of a Wi-Fi or a Bluetooth network and inhibit communications. And the patent for that technology has just been filed. So electronic warfare is going to be in a really interesting direction we're probably going to see expand in the future. The other thing I should mention is the development of the Internet of Things. And for those of you who don't know, this really refers to this concept of the fact that in our places of work and in our places of residence, the number of internet-connected devices we have online today is far, far greater than at any time in the past. So in our homes, in our places of work, we have things like lift systems, air conditioning systems, smart televisions, smart fridges, smart vehicles. All of these things are connected online. So our societies are connected online through more and more avenues than we ever have been in the past. Gartner Technology estimates by 2020, so just next year, given current trends in terms of the use of this type of technology, there'll be about 20.4 billion Internet of Things devices online, connected online. So quite a significant number. But it's not just in our places of work and in our residences where these devices are connected. It's also in critical pieces of infrastructure like hospitals and factories. So this is not in itself a bad thing, but often these devices are poorly secured. They don't have security front of mind when they're created and when they're designed. So this could be a potential avenue for targeting nation states and targeting critical pieces of infrastructure in nation states. And it's very, very difficult to predict how such an attack might unfold. But an example that's been raised in a number of quarters is where, for example, a nation state is targeted with a physical warfare attack, for example, airstrikes. And then that's supplemented by a cyber warfare attack in which a hospital that's heavily reliant on operational systems that are online, that are internet connected, are taken down. And that could either entirely, or at least in part, interfere with the ability of that hospital to function correctly at a really critical time. For example, when treating injured civilians, injured troops, and so forth. So when coupled with a physical warfare attack, the impacts of targeting internet-connected infrastructure in different nation states could be quite vast. Cyber espionage is a really interesting one that's gained a lot of prominence, particularly in the last 6 to 12 months. What it is at a very, very high level is where one nation state, over a period of it's not necessarily a one-off episode, it can happen over a period of several months, basically undertakes a very, very sophisticated intrusion into the computer systems of a foreign nation state for the purposes of extracting intelligence for political, economic, or military motivations. We've seen a number of examples of this occur in recent times. One of them occurred earlier this year, which no doubt many of you heard about. And the Australian Parliament and the major political parties suffered a significant cybersecurity breach that became public earlier this year. It's speculated that the source of this attack was China's Ministry of State Security. Investigations have still been ongoing. But what it provided was there was evidence that this attack or this compromise had occurred over a period of several months. And it provided attackers with access to classified policy papers, classified emails, classified information from the different political parties. Going back a few years ago, in the United States, the US Office of Personnel Management, this is basically the federal agency which manages the details of federal employees working for the US government, suffered a massive cybersecurity breach, which led to the leak of 21 million details, or sets of 21 million, the details of 21 million US citizens or federal employees, personal sensitive information. That included about 5 million sets of fingerprints that had been captured by the Office of Personnel Management. And again, that was attributed to Chinese state-based hackers based on research and or investigations that took place following the attack or the breach. Now, the really interesting thing about cyber espionage is it's raising a lot of concerns, which is affecting the relationship, the economic relationship between different countries. And one of the examples of this is the bans that have been imposed, that no doubt many of you have heard about, on Huawei. So Huawei has suffered bans both in the United States and Australia and in different parts of the world, precisely because there's a perception that it's closely linked to the Chinese government and could be used as a vehicle for cyber espionage attacks if its technology was used in the build of key pieces of infrastructure. So, for example, in Australia, Huawei is not permitted to offer any componentry to the national broadband network. It's been banned from supplying componentry to the rollout of 5G mobile networks. And in the United States, an executive order has been issued which prohibits Huawei from supplying prohibits US businesses from the use of IT technology from Huawei. So quite significant bans, and all related to these concerns around cyber espionage. Information warfare is a really, really interesting one and likely to be a significant player in future cyber warfare. At a fundamental level, what is information warfare? It really relates to this concept of, at a very high level, publishing significant amounts of false information or manipulated information for the purposes of influencing the behaviour of people in a foreign nation state. That's about as concrete a definition as you can come up with for it. Oftentimes it can be things like posting comments on social media or promoting certain perspectives or articles on social media. And social media is primarily the tool that's often used for information warfare campaigns because it has such a universal reach. There's an organisation in Russia that's got the label of the Internet Research Agency, and it has a physical office in St. Petersburg in Russia, and it's estimated to have an annual budget of around $10 million US. It employs hundreds of people across the nation of Russia, and its fundamental purpose is to create and launch information warfare campaigns, particularly promoting Russian political interests. So it's got very close links into the Kremlin. It's been widely speculated that it's been closely involved in key information warfare campaigns. So examples include all the kerfuffle that was around the 2016 US election and Russian interference in the outcome of that election. A lot of that is traced back to the Internet Research Agency, not just the Internet Research Agency, but the information warfare campaigns that form part of that, or are alleged to have formed part of that, can be traced back to this organisation. The ongoing Russian-Ukrainian conflict that's been in place since 2014 and still going on today. The Internet Research Agency is known to have launched a lot of information warfare campaigns focused on trying to influence the behaviour, particularly in the Ukraine, of people in the Ukraine, to the Russian intervention in Ukraine. But it's not just Russia that we're talking about. This is happening all over the world. China's also been speculated to be very, very heavy on information warfare. A 2016 study by Harvard University actually did a lot of research on this, and they found over a period of time when they did this research, they found that there are close to 450 million comments each year posted that were basically false or information warfare focused by this secret information army or this troll army that was hired by the Chinese government. And it was principally in place to advance Chinese political interests, and particularly around controversial times. So during party meetings or during protests, those information warfare campaigns would be particularly active. One of the challenges with information warfare is that it doesn't really fall into the category, it's such an unfamiliar or new form of warfare that it poses a number of challenges. So first of all, knowing when you as a nation state have been attacked as part of an information warfare campaign can be very, very hard to determine. But the outcomes can be so much more powerful nowadays than the use of military weaponry. Because particularly for societies where the population is able to strongly influence the government, if you can effectively over a period of time influence the opinions of the people in that country and they exert influence on their governments, then that can have a more powerful outcome than any physical warfare attack. How do you justify a response to an information warfare campaign? Again, that's another really, really difficult question to determine. Can it ever be said that an information warfare campaign is of such a magnitude that it could justify a physical response? by another nation state? Again, it's a very open question and one the international community is grappling with. Finally, and a really interesting issue too, particularly in democratic societies such as our own, where freedom of speech is a bellwether or is a fundamental principle of the society in which we live. Many issues are sufficiently controversial that in and of itself there are going to be a whole range of contrasting viewpoints, and that's just the nature of the society in which we live. So, for example, something like abortion is going to raise significant contrasting viewpoints. How do you know when that crosses over from legitimate public debate and goes into the realm of information warfare? How do you distinguish between what's becoming information warfare or a disinformation campaign vis-a-vis just standard public debate? A number of the social media companies, particularly Facebook's, actually established a dedicated part of their organisation to try and grapple with these questions and determine when something actually constitutes an information warfare campaign. And they work quite closely with law enforcement as part of doing this. But one of the challenges is it really the province of these companies to be determining what constitutes legitimate versus illegitimate or bogus information warfare campaign related speech? So this is something that's also going to be a significant issue, and it's indeed something that's being heavily discussed at the international level right now. Okay, fear of escalation. This is really about the emergence of concerns about a potential cyber Cold War. And what I mean by that is, as I said earlier on, the concerns around the Cold War in the 20th century really concerned nuclear warfare, and particularly involved rising tensions between Russia and the Soviet Union. A cyber Cold War, concerns about a cyber Cold War have existed for quite a few years. And really what this is about is the fact that there's concern that a number of countries or a number of nation states are undertaking preparatory activities where they're preemptively compromising critical pieces of infrastructure in foreign countries. And they're not actually acting upon those compromises, but simply planting the seed in anticipation of a future cyber Cold War, or a future cyber war, I should say. There's been a lot of interesting dialogue in this regard that's occurred even this year between Russia and the United States. And I just wanted to highlight that as an example. So at the beginning of this year, the US Director of National Security, Dan Coats, actually said that there was clear evidence that they had found that Russia had compromised a number of US electrical power facilities with malicious software and had demonstrated a capability to be able to interfere with the operation of those facilities. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. They've been warning about, or the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security have for a number of years been expressing concerns about the degree to which Russia has compromised US critical infrastructure assets. So things like power, oil pipelines, water plants, these types of things have all been speculated to have been subject to some degree of compromise by the Russian counterparts. The United States has also passed a military bill very, very recently, and it's used this to justify a response back in kind to Russia. So this is a military bill which effectively authorises clandestine military activity in cyberspace to protect and defend against cyber attacks against the United States. And that's been used as justification for Russia, or for the United States, to hint at basically that they've compromised certain Russian electrical assets in basically in anticipation of a future war, and in response to the fact that they believe Russia has compromised much of its infrastructure as well. What we don't know is the degree to which this is bluff or the degree to which this is real. It's probably somewhere in between. For us as members of the public, we only really see the tip of the iceberg. We don't really know what's going on behind the scenes because our governments keep a lot of that information relatively tight-lipped and for good reason. A lot of that information is highly classified. But the intentions behind these types of compromises are likely to be, as I've already hinted at, sowing the seeds for a potential future cyber conflict and being ready for a potential future cyber conflict by being in a position to access and target critical infrastructure assets of nation states, such as Russia, such as the United States, such as China. And also, it's been argued that it could serve as a potential warning or a deterrent from a potential future cyber war. If you can demonstrate that you've already compromised critical pieces of infrastructure, then perhaps that can actually serve as a deterrent from a future war. So I guess watch this space when it comes to the emergence of a potential cyber Cold War. And the last piece that I wanted to discuss today was this concept of establishing norms in the world of cyber warfare. Norms of war is really referring to this concept of what are the rules that govern warfare. So traditional warfare, as I mentioned right at the beginning of the presentation, is something that our country or our world is very, very familiar with, unfortunately. But because of that, we have very well established rules, such as in the Geneva Conventions, the Hague Conventions, and so forth, that govern the way nations engage in warfare legitimately. So there are key rules that are defined at an international level and well accepted around when one nation or how you go about declaring formal war against another country, how you go about protecting medical workers and treating prisoners of war appropriately. What are the tactics and weapons you can use legitimately versus illegitimately? So there are bans on things like chemical and biological weapons. And these are all captured in internationally accepted and legal instruments that are internationally sanctioned. Unfortunately, in the world of cyber warfare, this is still very much an open field, or it's largely open slather. There are developments that I'm going to briefly mention in a moment, but it's a much less mature field when it comes to cyber warfare. So, how do you apply traditional norms of warfare in the world of cyber warfare? So, for example, when do you actually consider a particular cyber attack to amount to an act of war? So can, for example, the information warfare campaigns that I referred to earlier on, is there ever grounds, given that it's such an unusual or an unorthodox form of warfare, are there ever grounds for considering that an act of war, which can justify a physical response or a response in kind by another nation state? Similar with cyber espionage. There's not necessarily immediate physical damage to another nation state, but there can be enormous damage through the information that's extracted. Can a sustained cyber espionage campaign ever constitute a significant enough act of war to justify a response by another nation state? And one of the things we often say, even when we're talking about traditional cybercrime in a context like AMP, is it's really bloody difficult to determine who's responsible for these attacks. Attributing accountability in the context of cyberspace, just by virtue of the universal reach of the internet, by virtue of its largely anonymous nature, being able to produce concrete evidence that a particular nation state was responsible for a specific cyber attack and using that to justify a response by another country is really difficult. So there's going to be a lot of, I think, challenges the world's going to face. And it's indeed being grappled with at this very moment at the international level, trying to determine what are the rules that need to govern cyber warfare. What this does create is a lack of certainty. And that lack of certainty is going to be exploited and has been exploited and is being exploited by a number of nation states. Because they know, when countries that launch cyber warfare attacks against another country know that because of the uncertainty that exists, it can be very, very difficult for another country to know what sort of footing it is on, what sort of legal standing it is on, to be able to respond effectively to that attack and have the sanctioning of the international community and the international law. There has been a considerable effort that's been put forward in recent times through a group of law scholars who have worked to produce something called the Tailend Manual. And this is basically a set of cyber warfare principles, or really a consideration of how traditional norms of war can be applied to cyber warfare. And it consists of about 154 rules, and it's a proposal for how we could move forward as a international community in terms of treating cyber warfare and what are the legitimate parameters within which cyber warfare occurs. But it's still very early in the piece, so it remains to be seen how effective that piece of work occurs. But there is recognition, and the United Nations is certainly spending a lot of time grappling with this question around cyber warfare. Okay, So, as you can see, I'm hardly an expert on cyber warfare because it's really it's really such an uncertain area. And the directions it's going to take in the next 10 or 15 years is really largely unknown. But we do know it's going to play a significant component of future global conflicts. Whether it largely replaces physical warfare, whether it serves as a complement to physical warfare, whether they're used hand in hand, whether there's ever instances, or whether it's largely where one nation responds with physical warfare and another nation responds with a cyber attack, remains to be seen. But it's a really, really interesting area, and there's a lot of stuff that's going on online and a lot of stories in the media about cyber warfare. So I'd encourage you, if it's an area that interests you, to keep your eye on it, because there's going to be a lot of new developments and a lot of interesting developments that happen in this space. So that's all I wanted to cover today, and I appreciate your attendance. This is our last Lunch and Learn of the year. So I just wanted to say thank you all for your engagement over the course of the year. It's really appreciated by the cybersecurity team. We will be running more Lunch and Learn events in the new year. So with all that said, I guess I can open it up to questions or comments if there are any. I'm not necessarily an expert on cyber warfare, but very happy to take any questions, or you can come up and speak to me afterwards. That's all I really wanted to cover today, so thank you very much for your attendance. Cheers. Any questions or comments, or yes?
So you're talking about various nation-states infiltrating and obviously finding weaknesses. When like America and Russia have found that there have been infiltration and malware or whatever it is put into the infrastructure, they just left it there. They don't do anything about it.
Yeah, I mean, they've obviously tried to take remedial action, but I think the concerns around that are that they may have only found the tip of the iceberg, and there may be other compromises that they don't necessarily know about. But yes, certainly, and the nature of these breaches is often that they're very sophisticated, so it can take a long time to detect them. And so I think the concerns with that are largely around there's a great unknown around the extent of the compromise and the amount of infrastructure that's been compromised. Yes.
The infrastructure, putting aside social media and so forth, but just the main infrastructure, surely you can only get into those systems if they're accessible via the internet.
Yes.
So, I mean, is not the solution simply that the very critical parts are closed off, but you've got to have something physically there to
Logically speaking, yes, but it doesn't always work that way. A lot of these campaigns have been very, very sophisticated, and there's sometimes very good justifications given for having these sorts of pieces of infrastructure connected online. So, for example, with smart electricity grids, so that they can communicate with other electricity assets and so deliver power more efficiently and so forth. But yes, logically speaking, that would be the answer. I just think because of the efficiencies associated with online connectivity, it's kind of that tension. They're kind of using a lot of online connected operational sensors and so forth, because there's a lot of conveniences and efficiencies associated with that, but that's creating these problems. Any other comments or questions? No. Okay. All right. Thanks very much for your attendance. And I should mention, I've been asked by the caterers if you can please just return your plates to the back of the room when you're done. Thank you. Cheers.